Welcome to all my friends and global community. My name is Bob Jayco, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Co-Creation magazine. I am also the founder of Co-Creation Global, and I'm also a channel for a consciousness called Soul. Today, I want to thank you for allowing me into your presence and into your home. And I want to share with you a very small portion of my journey in this particular experience and how I got from point A, from the beginning of this journey, to where I am today. And so in this introduction to my life, it's really about me learning to understand of what it is like to live in two worlds. This is actually a book that I'm in the process of writing called Co-Creation Revealed. And it's a journey between the world of the physical and the world of the unseen. And it begins in 1945. My parents were actually in a displaced person camp in Germany towards the end of the war. And I was born in a displaced persons camp at that time. We came to Australia in 1951 as immigrants with nothing more than what we had in our suitcase. And my parents worked really hard to build a life from poverty into some form of comfort. I learnt a lot from my mother, who was actually a very intuitive and very wise woman when it came to living a life of comfort. And she worked really hard to give us a good life. My father, on the other hand, was not so kind. He was an alcoholic, and he was a wife beater, and he was a Bob beater. He used to beat me up all the time. And because I was wasn't a rebellious child, but I had a lot of wisdom that normally children of my age don't have. And I was always prepared to get the last word in. So therefore, I would often get not one beating, but two, just simply talking back. Over the years, that took its toll. And I started to regress. I started to go into myself. And around the age of 10, I started to get a voice, not voices, a voice that would talk to me. And that voice, I called it the inner voice, but I really gave it a label called the presence. And this voice was actually a voice that stayed with me for virtually still today. And when I first encountered the voice or heard the voice, I got it actually in a way that I hear things like you normally would hear things in your ears. I would hear that in my head, and I could have an inner conversation with this consciousness, this presence. And it began to ask me to look at the world through the eyes of education, of the books. And I was given intuitive impulses to actually start reading books on philosophy, mythology, ancient history, different religions, the occult, spirituality, and all sorts of things. Basically, I was reading university standard philosophy books and mythology books and stuff like that at the age of 10 years. I would pedal up to the library, pick up 8 books, and then come home, read them, and then repeat and repeat and repeat. So for almost 10 10 years, I did this. I read books on everything to do with the human experience as written. My life was very much an inner life. I didn't have a lot of friends, and I sort of kept to myself. I was really quite shy and introverted, mainly because of the domestic situation. And even when I went to school, a lot of my teachers were bullies. They would intimidate me and other kids, which they sort of picked on. I don't know what the energy was, but we were picked on. And so for that period of time during my years in high school, I encountered, or as I realise today, I actually co-created these teachers to create another part of me that I needed to bring out. This period was a period where I was so intensely devalued in myself that whenever I was picked on, I closed down. I closed down actually physically in my voice. Whenever somebody picked on me, I could not express myself. My mouth would open and nothing would come out. There was so much rage inside of me that I couldn't communicate. And I knew that if I didn't find some way of resolving this and fixing this, there would be no way that I would be doing what I did today. So it was in my third year at high school, and I was at a high school that was involved in the performing arts, and the high school had a tradition of school musicals. And for people to get into these musicals, you had an incentive. You didn't have to do certain assignments, you had spare time, you did all sorts of things. So a friend of mine, Terry, decided that we should have a go and get into the chorus, because the chorus is easy work and you'd have to do a bit of acting and singing as a chorus. And so we decided one day that we'd front up. The call came in for people to attend auditions. So we went to the audition, and we were in a queue waiting to be individually auditioned, and Terry turned to me and said, "Hey, we're actually in the wrong auditions. This is for principals." And I was next in line to get on stage, and I said, "Hell, I can't sing. I'm not going to go out there as a principal." And so they called next, and I said, "I'm not going out." And Terry said, "No, you can do that." So he gave me a shove, and I was propelled out into the middle of the stage. And the musical director said, "Okay, what's your name? And what are you going to sing?" So I gave her the song, and she played the music in the key, and I opened my mouth and nothing, croak, groan. And so she said, "Okay, let's try that again." So she repeated it and still nothing. Anyway, she then stopped, came up to the stage and looked at me and said, "Look, tell me what your favourite musician is or your favourite singer is." So for those of you who have been around as long as I have, you may not remember the singer. His name was Mario Lanza, a singer who died in '59, but he was a tremendous tenor. And I loved his work and I loved the way he sang. So I said, "Look, Mario Lanza." And so she sat me down and said, "Sit over there for 5 minutes and imagine that you are Mario Lanza." So I did that. It was like an internal meditation. So imagine you are Mario Lanza. You can sing like Mario Lanza. You have the power of Mario Lanza, and you have the range. And so I did that for 5 minutes. And anyway, I said, "Okay, I think I'm ready to do this." And so she then called me back and turned the microphone back on, started the intro to the piece I was singing, and away I went. Now, I sang it, and I didn't have a... It sounded okay. It was loud, and she stopped the piece 3/4 of the way through, and said, "Okay, yeah, that's fine. Stop." And she then went over to the stage director, who also played the piano, and said, "Look, can you play the piano? And I'm going to go down to the back of the hall, and I want to listen to this young man sing." So she did that, and then the stage director said, "Okay, I'm going to play that thing, sing it again." But they turned the microphone off, and this hall took about 1,500 to 2,000 people. So I sang without a microphone, and she came back and she came up to me and said, "You have a really powerful voice with a really good range. You're a tenor." And so that situation kicked me into what eventually healed my voice and gave me confidence and an understanding that I could create something else that I wasn't. I could become something else. And this is an interesting part of the story, because it's probably a message for many of you. You're more than one thing. I realized I could sing. I was told I could sing, and I did. So I got the second lead role in that musical, because the principal role was a baritone. It was not in my range. But for the few years I was left at high school, I did 5 other musicals as lead singer in those musicals. And then I went out and my parents paid for a voice coach, and I developed that. And so that kicked me off into the field of singing. I wasn't professional, I was always amateur, but I sang with musical companies around Australia for nearly 30 years. I did my thing at college and university, and I still sang during those periods of time. But I left Australia in 1969 to travel what I thought was about a year of travelling around the world. Now, I said to you that soul was, or this presence, was a presence that gave me what I call compulsive impulses, to do things. And for the whole period I was at university, I had this urge to travel, just urge. And on my 21st birthday, I packed my bags and I got on a plane and I headed towards Europe. But I didn't stop there, I didn't start there. I ended up going to Singapore, Thailand, Greece, and many other countries in Turkey, the Middle East. And it took what I thought was going to be, just a little hop, step and a jump, and I'd be in London. I actually took a year and a half to get to London. And again, it was this impulse and the synchronicities that I met people along the way that became friends, and they became confidence. They actually showed me, they helped me, was a revelation in understanding the kindness of humans and the kindness of other people who were initially strangers that ended up becoming really close friends. And from people in Iran that I knew, people in Israel, people in Turkey. I ended up digging pots and pans out of archaeological digs in Ankara. I was in Greece, around Macedonia, digging around and travelling. And everywhere along the line I met somebody that helped me out, that showed me the way. And it was like presence was actually instigating all of these connections, these synchronicities and everything else. eventually I arrived in London, which is my base of operations, and I got a flat and shared it with a couple of other Aussies and South Africans. And then I would travel. I travelled around Europe and lived in Europe, in Spain, Italy, places like that, for nearly another year till I ran out of money. And then, for no other reason except that I needed to work and to get money, I started to having to look around for a job. And you know, I was out of university. I hadn't a lot of experience at that, except for part-time and during holidays and other periods. I worked for a medical company in Western Australia as a sales guy, and also in warehousing and everything else. So I'd had a bit of sales experience, and so I said, well, I need a job, help me out here. And so I was on my way to, in a place called Knightsbridge, going to Buckingham Palace. And this guy was putting up a sign called Western Man Clerical Recruitment. Now, he's a Canadian called Tom. And he was outside, and I was looking at the board saying, you know, and he looked at me and said, looking for a job? And I said, yeah, yeah, I am. And so we had a discussion, and he said, look, I'm not open yet, and I will be open in a couple of weeks. He said, do you have any sales experience? I said, certainly have. He said, come back and talk to me. So I waited for the 2 weeks, and I said, well, I have really no experience in recruitment and in clerical, you know, knowing about clerical jobs. But so I just put myself into what I call the Mario Lanza effect. And I began to just assume that I already had the job, and I assumed that I already knew the job. And so when I met Tom 2.5 weeks later, we had a conversation at the pub, and he said, look, I'll give you a try. So he gave me the job, and I was in it for around 9 months, and I did really well, but I needed a little bit more money than they were paying. And so I was then walking down Baker Street in London, and there was another sign going up called Reed Computing Personnel. So I ran up the stairs, and the sign was new, and they were putting it up, and there's workmen everywhere. So I called out and said, hey, is the manager around? And this Australian came over to me and said, yeah, mate, what can I do for you? And he was the manager, and he said, are you looking for people to work, you know, as recruiters? He said, yes, we are, actually, but we're not open for 6 weeks. So what's your background? I said, well, I'm working for another company, but it's in clerical. And he said to me, do you know anything about the computer industry, computer staff, what they do? I said, no, but give me 4 weeks. And if I can't answer any of your questions, then don't give me the job. So I spent 4 weeks in the library learning everything about the computer industry. And when I met Tim, he said, okay, I'm going to ask you all these questions, and I answered every one. So he gave me the job. So I ended up being the senior recruiter for Reed Personnel in London at a 50% increase in salary. And so the story I'm trying to tell here is that all these links were not coincidental. They were synchronistic. I met one and and it was like I was being guided towards all these particular events, because having been in that industry, in fact, I met a young lady in Scotland where my cousin lived, and we sort of connected and developed a relationship. So I wanted to move to Scotland, and because of my connections in the recruitment industry, I landed the job of sales manager for a medical company in Scotland, where I lived for around 4 years. Then I got the compulsion to come back to Australia, and I brought with me my then wife and 2 adopted children and started life in Western Australia back in '72. And my first job was a manager for the sales manager for a major drug company. I got into the field of pharmaceuticals because I've always had a leaning towards healing, and not being a totally conscious individual, but still being guided by the presence. They sort of like every job I seem to have got that come into my field of experience was directing me in a particular way, in a directed path. So I got this job and I was with this company for many years until I realised what the pharmaceutical industry was all about. And I worked my way up through the ranks to a very senior management position as head of oncological drugs for this company for Southeast Asia. And I was the major interface between hospitals, clinical trials and oncologists throughout Southeast Asia, so I travelled a lot. And what I found out about it is the pharmaceutical industry wasn't about healing, it was about money. And not only that, a personal friend of mine developed cancer. He was also in the pharmaceutical industry, another company. And we had launched a drug that was new, and it was an experimental drug, and it was a late stage drug for cancer of the testes. And he was in really bad shape. And when he was given this drug, it killed him. And I was devastated, and I actually left the pharmaceutical industry. My next synchronistic event was I met a guy, and I was still working for the pharmaceutical industry, who was an Ayurvedic master practitioner. And we actually met at a party, and I started talking to him, and I was asking me questions about alternative medicine, energy medicine, which I'd had an interest in, and I had been doing a fair amount of reading on. And he invited me to apprentice with him, which I did for 3 years. Excuse me. And I worked with him as a personal apprentice, and he taught me everything about energy medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, herbal medicine, nutritional medicine. So when I left the pharmaceutical industry around 1980, there was this compulsion to move from Perth, from Western Australia, to Sydney. And then my then wife, Margaret, said, well, you know, we've just bought a new house and everything else. And she said, why do we need to move? And I said, I can't give you an answer. It is just a compulsion to move. And we had no kids then, because it was a second marriage. And so we packed up our goods and chattels and we moved to Sydney. And in Sydney, it took me about a year. Margaret had found a job and I was still pottering around finding my feet. But eventually I found a place, and I established a clinic in pain management and in chronic healing. And I started the first clinical practice in Sydney in 1983 in the field of energy medicine and pain management and chronic disease, based on magnetic field therapy, acupuncture, well before it was known. And remember, the 80s was a period where alternative medicine was virtually unknown. And sound therapy, colour therapy, many different modalities, the use of crystals, the use of bush flowers, all of those were involved. It was in that clinic that I began to evolve. And I began to evolve because presence was actually giving me information. I was able to begin to read the human body, and I was able to see the distortions in the different parts of the body, the fields of information, as I used to call them. And because I had a very good grounding in physiology and anatomy, I could understand exactly what was going on in the organ or the system. And I also got to understand where the disease came from in its origins. And I would give this information to the people who were really quite stunned that I was able to read their history. And I had no label on it at that time. I just simply said I could read information in the energy field and correctly diagnose them. My diagnostic abilities was about 80 to 85%. And not only that, it evolved into being able to actually produce a protocol for managing the disease as well. So the herbs would come into my head, vitamins and minerals, different modalities, colours, magnetic field on the acupuncture points. All of those would come in, and I would write the protocol, and I'd treat them. And the protocols were really successful. And I was dealing with really sick people and really chronically injured people. And so for that whole period of time, somebody came along and gave me a label, and they called me a medical intuitive, and I said, fine, okay. But it was just simply a natural thing that extended from my exposure and my work with presence. At the same time, during that period, a lot of my clients were, because my office was in the financial districts of Sydney, I got a lot of guys, and they were mainly guys, who were CEOs of large insurance companies, finance companies, banks, and everything else that ended up with back problems, knee problems, elbow problems. And so I'd do the same thing. I was diagnosing them, and one particular guy asked me a question. He said, how do you know that stuff? He said, well, I do. He said, can you teach it? And I said, I don't know, but I think I can. He said, can you teach it to me? I said, probably. And so we made an arrangement. He wouldn't let me come to his office because people, his board would think he'd gone off the deep end. So I would go down to his house on an evening during the week, and I'd teach him what eventually became business intuition. It was a side event, but it was another part. It was another step towards another extension of my journey. And this went on for a couple of years, and he introduced me to others in the same field, and I started to develop a coaching clientele of senior execs in the financial industry and teaching them business intuition. And then we evolved into what I call corporate creativity in those days. And even we, as a group of us, got together and we attempted to pull together a group to sponsor spiritual business, but it was a little bit early, so it never really took off. But around 1989, 90, I got the compulsion to close the business down. And it's like the voice said, it's time for you to move to the next level. So I really resisted this. I didn't want to do it. I had a good practice. It was solid. I had plenty of clients. And this compulsion kept coming. He said, time to close the practice down. I resisted that for nearly 6 or 7 months. Eventually, the practice, for no explainable reason, started to slow down. And I said, I got the message. So one weekend, I just shut it down. And went to my unit and sat there for 3 months waiting for something to happen. So I meditated and I said, well, what's next and what's going on, and what am I supposed to do? And around the 3rd month, I was sitting in my living room and suddenly this whole download of courses came down. I was scribbling away on techniques to teach people. And the techniques were coming down were techniques about creativity, but also to do with intuition, medical intuition courses, business intuition courses, and generic intuition. All of these came down. And then from that, I started to advertise in local journals. And my first course was run out of my unit in Sydney, where I hired 20 chairs and I put them out there, and it was a weekend workshop and it was full. And so I said, cool, this is working really well. The next course, which was 6 weeks later, had twice as many people, and my unit was packed to the gills. Absolutely every place and space was packed. So I couldn't handle that for the next course if it got bigger. So down the road was a centre which ran different rooms for seminars. So I hired the biggest seminar room that I could find, was 90 people. And I advertised, and that took 8 weeks for the course to fill up. I actually filled that room with 90 people in a space of 8 weeks. Remember, there's no internet these days. This was all, old school. You advertise in a paper, people respond, they send you an envelope with with the check, deposit, and whatever, and you register them, and you talk to them by phone, okay, landline, and so it was old school. But anyway, I filled that course up, and then I moved from just running it in Sydney, and I went to Melbourne, and within a year I was running courses all over Australia and New Zealand, in various courses in different times on business, medical, and generic intuition. I was called the intuition guy, and it was really, really fun stuff, and I always enhanced the courses, and people loved the vitality of the information. But in many ways, when I was actually doing the course, I would go out of my body. And what happened was that I didn't run the course. Presence did. It just came through me. And, people would say, well, that was a great thing you said. And I said, what did I say? And I couldn't remember. I'd present, and all my courses were really spontaneous. There was no organisation. There was no precept. I did have overheads, but I never used them. It was just downloaded. And people came out and said, great course, and said, when are you going to do another one? So I added extensions to it, intermediate courses and advanced, and then eventually did coaching, one-to-one coaching in those specific courses. And at that time, I think it was, when was it, 1997, I got the next compulsion. Here I was in Sydney, running my thing, my business, and it's all really going well. And then Presence said, you've got to move to Brisbane. I said, what's in Brisbane? No answer. Move to Brisbane. So I had an assistant. She organised a unit for me, a place to live in Brisbane. So I just packed all my goods and chattels in Sydney and moved to Brisbane. You see, I had learnt by then to trust my internal compulsions, as I call them, to trust them implicitly, not question them, just do it, because every step took me to another step, and it was a different step. It was actually not a step I actually really anticipated it happening, but once I moved to Brisbane, within a year, I met my present wife, Jen, and we developed the relationship, and we then came together and started living together. In about 2002, I retired because Jen was not well and I needed to support her. And so from 2002 to 2016, we were fortunate to have co-created a very good income for ourselves, so we weren't financially struggling. And that period of time, not only was I working in a support role for my wife, but I had the time to learn to live in the present moment, to be able to get up and do what I pleased. And what I learned is the freedom to be able to choose whatever I wanted to choose, without having to be constrained about going to a job and working for somebody and for so many hours and coming home and then only having a choice-based work for a short period of time, like the weekends or the evenings. So it was a really interesting time. It was living in the moment, living in the present, and having the freedom to do. You know, you get up and say, well, okay, let's go for a picnic with the dogs, or go to the beach, do all those sort of things. But it was also a time then I became a little conscious about how I was manifesting and co-creating in the world, that we had managed to co-create an income stream that went on forever. As long as we lived, we got it. And that we never had to work. We paid a lot of tax, and that was okay. And that we had a really comfortable life, a life of choice, a life of ease. And I remember, in retrospect, around 10 to 15 years prior to that, that I said to Source, I don't want to work hard. I want an easy life. I want a life of freedom and comfort. But I'd forgotten that I'd asked for that. So suddenly the two started to click, and I was becoming aware that I was the co-creator of all the things that were happening in my life. That was the first thing that happened. So in 2012, I used to have ongoing conversations with presence. And so in that particular year, I remember that year particularly because that's the year that soul came into existence. And I use the word soul. Presence agreed to reveal what it was in its origins. And it's a discussion, and it's a video we've already done, but the quick version is that the presence was always the wisdom of infinite source. It was always with me. It was who I am. It is who you are. It is what all humanity is. It is the one singularity consciousness that created everything. And I asked in the conversation, well, okay, if we are going to do anything with this, humans like the idea of talking, labeling things. And so what are we going to call you? Data stream, consciousness, or what? And I said, well, okay, why don't you try soul, S-O-L? And I said, what does that mean? And said, well, it's called signals of love. So that's exactly what we are. We're an energy, and we're that energy that is the pervading love of all things. I said, cool, that's fine. It's most people will be happy to to understand that. And so the conversation continued. You see, I've always had all of this wisdom that comes through me, and I've never really shared it. And it was not until, and I've kept it inside. I shared a bit of it when I was teaching intuition, all the intuition courses, but not really the full extent of it. And in 2016, it actually happened when I was mowing the front lawn, and Sol popped in and said, it's time for you to come out of retirement and become the physical presence for our messages of co-creation to the world's global community. And I sat with that and said, well, what do you mean? And so, as I have explained in previous videos, what was rolled out was a vision plan that spanned 30 years for me to assist and connect and collect a group of transformational agents, 300 million of you, to assist in changing the consciousness of the other 7 billion. I sat with that for 18 months, and because the whole fabric of that vision plan was so vast and so overwhelming, I just froze up. And then around about, that's the early part of 2018, I then decided that I would choose to have an attempt to it, to give it a go. But I made a deal with Source, and that was, if I'm to do this, I want you to co-create and give to me all the resources, all of the people, all the money that is necessary to make this, all the connections, all of the communities that are going to come to, all the groups that are going to make this work. And Source began delivering. It started with the appearance of the magazine, which many of you have started to read or have discovered, and the magazine, which is now carries our header called Co-Creation Magazine, and that was the first start of it. And the next sequence is about to go into action. So I could say that at this point in time, my story doesn't end. It's actually the beginning of a new chapter, and a chapter that hasn't been written yet. It is still in process. And I'm inviting you to follow the book, to follow the chapter, to see where it takes me, and if you're inspired to join us in this movement and this community, become part of writing the book that will lead to the vision being fulfilled into the world. So, look, I'm really most delighted to be able to share this short version of my story. It's not easy to be able to sit here in front of you and roll out, some very intimate details of my pain and my anguish and my journey. But I thought that because there's a central theme, and that theme is trusting your inner voice. Listen to it, trust it, use it, engage in it, and begin to understand what co-creation, that you are and always have been the co-creator of everything. Thank you for listening to me. I'm most blessed that you're allowing me into your homes and businesses to tell my story, and I look forward to many more broadcasts in the future. Love to you all.